Thank you. Thank you very much. Enthusiastic fans of your new book.
Well, thank you for your time. It's very precious.
Thank you for inviting me.
Now, let's start with something that you make very clear. You say we use our atmosphere as a sewer. We dump 162 million tons of CO2 in it every day. You are also absolutely clear that COP28 must have countries agreeing to phasing out fossil fuels without any caveats, if it is to make any progress on this real crisis. But the reason it has taken us until COP28 to even talk about phasing out fossil fuels is because of what happened at COP1 in Berlin in 1995. You were there. That's when it was decided that the progress at COPs can only happen through consensus. Why are we stuck with this process that only produces the minimum viable progress that every country, including petrostates, agree on?
Well, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for this question. I want to make a brief passing comment about that thin blue line that you referred to. I always want to make the point so that it really sinks in if anybody hasn't really looked into this. That thin blue line is blue because that's where the oxygen is that refracts the blue light with nitrogen. You've got a PhD in this stuff, so I have to be careful what I say. But if you could drive a car straight up in the air at interstate highway speeds, you get to the top of it in 5 to 7 minutes. You could walk it in an hour. That's what we're using as an open sewer. Now to your question, and it lingers there. On average, each molecule stays 100 years. And the accumulated amount now traps as much extra heat as would be released by 750,000 Hiroshima-class atomic bombs exploding on the Earth every 24 hours. So it's not a good thing. We need to stop doing this. And the reason we've had such difficulty even discussing the main problem directly for all of these years, since the summer of 1992, I was in Rio at the Earth Summit. It took 3 years to organize the first COP. The president was a charismatic young environment minister from Germany, Angela Merkel. And the first order of business was to adopt the rules for voting, and Saudi Arabia objected. And since consensus was required before the rules were adopted, it was laid on the table. There was a very famous, in those days, very famous coal lobbyist from the United States named Don Perlman. I never speak ill of the departed, but he was extremely influential, really legendary, working hand in glove with the Saudi Arabian delegation. And so since the rules could not be adopted over Saudi Arabia's objections, the default procedure was the requirement for consensus. And the word consensus differs in definition from unanimity in the eye of the president of the COP. So the enormous power wielded by the president of a COP, any COP, comes from the discretion that person has as the moderator, chair, presiding officer, to either recognize an objection or not. And there have been plenty of times, as you know, Akshat, where Vanuatu or one of the other small, most threatened nations near the back of the chamber is waving their arms to object. Oh, well, seeing no objection, so ordered. But if the Saudi delegation, wherever they are, raises the hand, whoop, no, we don't have consensus, sorry. And so the situation that leaves our world community in is that we have to beg for permission
from
the petrostates. Please, sir, may we protect the future of humanity? No, sorry. And yesterday, Abdulaziz bin Salman, the energy minister in Saudi Arabia, gave an interview on television in Riyadh and was asked not about a measure to phase out fossil fuels, which of course is what we need, but a measure to phase down fossil fuels. Would you accept that? He said, absolutely not.
Yep.
So here we are. Once again, we have to go to the largest petrostate and say, may we have your permission to do something to protect our grandchildren and all future generations? No, absolutely not.
Well, you have said that there is a way to reform this COP process. It'll require parties to bring a resolution 6 months ahead of a COP.
Yes.
It'll require 75% of the
Right,
parties
3/4.
voting in favor to get rid of the consensus and put in place perhaps a supermajority or whatever the parties decide,
Right.
but something that is not a consensus.
Right.
Now, do you think that can ever happen? Are you pushing for it? And who else needs to be involved to make it happen?
Yeah, I think it's difficult, extremely difficult, but I think it is time to push for it because the stakes are so high. We have to try every strategy to save our future. There's a detail that is important to emphasize, Akshat. The amendment has to be to the underlying treaty from Rio in '92. I chaired the U.S. Senate delegation to Rio that year. There are those international lawyers who will hear this proposal for reform and based on their knowledge of dealing with these COPs, they say, no, you can't do that. And they're right. If you just try to amend the rules of the particular COP, you can't. But if you go back to the original treaty, all of these COPs are legally appended to the original treaty. And if you amend that original treaty, you can put in a supermajority proposal. There are two countries, Papua New Guinea and Mexico, I believe, that have jointly proposed this several times in the past. You're really on top of this because you've already pointed out it has to be laid on the table 6 months before the COP. Good for you. And it has not been this time. And of course, this is not the president of the COP to make this happen, but next time it should be done. I do plan to argue in favor of that, and I do plan to do my best to round up some advocates who will also do so.
Now, you have made the case that the hegemonic system we have right now that produces the most progress is democratic capitalism. We'll come to the democracy part a little later. Let's focus on capitalism. After you left politics, you founded Generation Investment Management. It manages some $30 billion. Its
45.
goal, 45.
Not that it matters. But,
its goal is to show that it's possible to do good and to make money. An analysis by my colleague Sejal Kishan looked at one of those funds where you've invested in equities and found that about half of the holdings had increase in emissions between 2015 and 2021, which is sort of the post-Paris period. Now, that's not the only thing that's happened. There's been a huge political backlash on ESG, the very metric that we can use to try and correct the problems that unfettered capitalism that does not take externalities into consideration could correct. But that backlash is causing many of the investors who could see light, who could figure out, yes, there's a way in which capitalism isn't a problem for climate change, but a solution. So what needs to happen now? How do we figure out whether capitalism can play a positive role?
the author of Climate Capitalism. So I'll do my best to have this exchange with you. First of all, there are two funds, Dublin and London, and yes, sometimes the numbers are, you have to add them both together. But in any case, I co-founded it with my partner David Blood, and who was the CEO of Goldman Sachs Asset Management for 11 years, and other partners. This is an old joke, but it's literally true that I wanted to name the business Blood and Gore, but the other partners. I mean, I thought we'd have instant brand recognition. I mean, well, come on. But our other co-founders were not really enthusiastic about it. But the whole theory is to invest completely through the sustainability lens. Now, On the large subject you've raised, Akshat, and that you've studied and written about so eloquently, I have some idiosyncratic views about this. First of all, I am a capitalist, and I do believe that capitalism is, in a way, a bit like gravity in the sense that it's always there and always has been, and to pretend otherwise is a waste of time. I think there are thoughtful people who disagree, but the alternatives to the left and right of market capitalism that were tried in the 20th century did not really work out too well. And I do think that with reforms, capitalism is the most useful tool to solve the climate crisis. In North America and the European Union, well, in North America, if you look at all of the capital that's been spent to deploy solar and wind, 96% of it is from the private sector, only 4% from public funding. Now, because of the unequal access to private lending in developing countries, because of currency valuation, fluctuation risk, and other country risks, those percentages are often reversed. In Nigeria, only 14% is from the capital, is from private capital for the renewable energy revolution. 86% has to come from governments, and they don't have it. So we need to reform the access to borrowing capacity for developing countries. But the reforms need to go much deeper than that. My friend Klaus Schwab, who founded the World Economic Forum 50 some odd years ago, has famously argued to move away from the exclusive focus on shareholders and have multi-stakeholder analysis, and I think that more and more people have been moving in that direction. But there is a deeper set of reforms that are difficult to implement, and if you'll let me have just a moment on this. In the interwar period in 1937, when economists were trying to give policymakers better tools to avoid another Great Depression, a great legendary economist named Simon Kuznets came up with what are referred to as the national accounts. And most corporate accounting categories are derived from the national accounts. And it was a brilliant piece of work. But when he received his many prizes and awards, he made speeches and said, please do not use this system, these national accounts, as a guide for national economic policy, because it leaves too much out. And then 7 years later at Bretton Woods, it was completely codified, and we still use it. It's sort of like the old QWERTY keyboard on the typewriters. It makes no sense, but it's a difficult thing to change. I'm sorry, go ahead.
This is the gross domestic product that we use.
Yeah, GDP is the version of it that is best known. But he said, what is left out? Four categories of value. And of course, these accounting categories are how we determine and decide what is valuable in our lives and in the economy. What's left out? The first is fairly well known. It's almost a buzz phrase: negative externalities. All of the global warming pollution is a negative externality. It's not included in the accounting categories, government or corporate. The second thing that's left out is a little bit, is less well known: positive externalities. Now, what's that? If a community invests in mental health care, that's an expense on the town budget. When the benefits of that care, if it's delivered well, come rolling back in the years and even decades afterwards, that is not counted as income. So the structural bias is to avoid the expense because you're not getting any income as a result. The third category is depletion of natural resources. Now, there are three categories that really exemplify this part of the problem. Underground water aquifers, out of sight, out of mind, soon out of water. Topsoil. We are still losing enormous amounts of very valuable topsoil that can only be replaced over centuries. And then, most important of all, the web of living species of which we humans are a part. We're in the middle of a great extinction crisis, and by some estimates, we could lose 50% of the living species with which we share this earth in this century on our watch. That can't be good. So if all four of those things are left out, you get this anomaly where since this dashboard, these metrics are our guide for success at the national level. Oh, GDP went up 3%. Oh my gosh, look, this country's gone up 5%. Yay, big cheers. But it's accompanied by vast increases in global warming pollution, chronic underinvestment in public goods like education and healthcare and mental health care and environmental protection, reckless depreciation of groundwater topsoil and the fraying of the biodiversity, the fourth thing that's left out is the distribution of incomes and net worths, which are affected profoundly by things like tax policy and regulatory policy. So GDP goes up and people celebrate, and it's accompanied by all these bad things, plus the emergence of inequality that has morphed into hyper inequality. And when the vast majority of income goes to the top 1/10 of 1%, and the average middle class in most countries have no inflation-adjusted increase in income for 45 years, they vote for some demagogic populist authoritarian, of which there are too many running around these days, including, I'm embarrassed to say, back in my country.
Well, you knew I was going to ask you a democracy question next. We are sitting here in a petrostate, which has done arguably more in the region to move away from fossil fuels than other countries. Yet a little less than 30% of its flawed gross domestic product.
When you say they've moved more away from...
Well,
didn't you write the story that said Masdar is not operating 20 gigawatts of renewables, but only 3.2 gigawatts?
I did, yes.
Okay, just wanted to double check that.
Compared to Saudi Arabia.
Moving right along.
Compared to Saudi Arabia, the UAE gets its income, gross domestic product,
low bar to clear,
yes, low bar. So a lower bar. The US, on the other hand, gets only 3% of its gross domestic product from fossil fuels. Yet when the Republican Party is in power, it acts like a petrostate, does on climate change. So, big question, what needs to be done to fix the democratic crisis in the US?
Yeah.
Second biggest polluter annually, largest polluter historically, to make it a credible partner in the climate fight, not just under Joe Biden's leadership, but every president to come.
My country is the largest producer of oil now and the largest producer of gas as well. More oil than Saudi Arabia, more gas than Qatar. But there is a transition underway, and the IRA is, as most understand, by far the best and biggest climate legislation any country's ever passed. The newest estimates indicate it will probably allocate $1.2 trillion to the acceleration of the deployment of renewable energy batteries. There used to be one gigafactory making these batteries. Now there are 195, and there are another 401 in the pipeline. This is an incredible revolution. But to your larger question, Akshat, alongside the climate crisis, we also have a democracy crisis. And I've tried to understand the causes of this. They are many. But I have what some might regard as an idiosyncratic view about it. I was a devotee of Marshall McLuhan back in my college days, and others in Daniel Bell. There were other theorists. And I believe that forgive the geeky phrase, the information ecosystem within which self-government takes place is really important. And the institutions of representative democracy innovated in the United States were constructed during the age of the printing press. And of course, the printing press begat this enormous revolution. Some of the distinctions with the Islamic and Arab world came because 15 years after Gutenberg introduced the press, the Ottoman Empire banned the printing of the Prophet's language, and so they missed the Enlightenment. Ironic because the library in Baghdad, and I mean, it had been the pinnacle of the early scientific revolution. But in the United States and in Western countries and other nations that have adopted a form of representative democracy that's similar to the one innovated in the US, the shift from an information ecosystem based on print to one based on broadcasting and then moving on to the internet and to social media has disrupted the balances that used to exist that made representative democracy work much better. These centralized information systems tempt autocrats to control information. You know, Hitler's book, The Triumph of the Will, implies a question, triumph over what? One thing it triumphs over is the authority of knowledge, because a free self-governing people rely on a shared base of knowledge that serves as a basis for reasoning together collectively. But if you have social media that is dominated by algorithms that pull people down these rabbit holes that are a bit like pitcher plants, these algorithms, they are the digital equivalent of AR-15s. They ought to be banned. They really ought to be banned. It's an abuse of the public forum. But when people are pulled down these rabbit holes, you know what's at the bottom of the rabbit hole? That's where the echo chamber is. And if you spend too much time in the echo chamber, what's weaponized is another form of AI, not artificial intelligence, artificial insanity. I'm serious. I'm serious. QAnon is just the best known version of artificial insanity. And these devices are the enemies of self-government, and they're the enemies of democracy. We need reforms for both democracy and capitalism. Both sets of reforms are possible.
Well, it seems tackling climate change might be actually easier than trying to figure out how to fix democracy.
You know, we hear this new word, polycrisis, so many different crises. I think that solving climate change is a poly-solution, and I really believe that, because we have a shared planetary priority to save humanity's future. We are in way more danger right now than most people realize. You're probably aware that 1.5 million people in East Africa are forced from their homes today by another of the rain bombs that's a direct consequence, much worse because of the climate crisis. You may be aware that this summer here in Dubai, the feels-like temperatures, the combination of temperature and humidity have been up to 60 degrees. 62 degrees in China last year, hottest temperature ever. But we are now seeing a very real and present danger of 1 billion climate refugees crossing international borders to escape conditions that the scientists tell us are becoming physiologically unlivable. And if this authoritarian populism is provoked by a few million climate refugees coming from the Eastern Mediterranean to Hungary and Orban land and whatever, what about 1 billion, which is what the Lancet projects may be possible? Yeah. So I honestly think that getting our collective act together in order to solve the climate crisis could be the engine that pulls solutions for democracy and capitalism and the extinction crisis. Because if we can reconstruct an ability to share a common base of accepted knowledge and reason together towards solutions for our crises, I think that is the pathway to restoration of sanity and self-governance.
Well, we could continue to talk for a long time. I will say, and I will say this on behalf of many people here, having somebody in your position for this long, in places of power, in places where you can talk to power, has been really helpful in figuring out, even if we've made finite progress, that finite progress may not have happened had there been not people like you.
You're very kind.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.